So I'll just jump right in. You can see the title of my talk here is Neuroplasticity, How to Teach an Old Brain New Tricks. And I wanted to pause actually on this first title slide, which is maybe not common. Most folks just kind of zip right through, but I wanted to break down the meaning of that word neuroplasticity, just so that we're all on the same page for the rest of this evening as far as what we're talking about. So I find it's helpful to break words, especially words in science or biology, down into pieces to better understand them. And the first part of that word, neuroplasticity, if you look at the neuro part, it's referring to neurons, which is the same thing as a nerve, right? So neurons are a type of cell that we find in our body, and we certainly find them in our brains. And so neuro is referring to nerves or neurons. And then the second part of that word, plasticity, you may have noticed that it has the term plastic in it, in the word itself. And maybe if you think about different types of plastic, certainly not all plastics are this malleable, but many plastics they're easily melted or molded or malleable or changeable. And so that's literally what that word neuroplasticity means, is the changeability of nerves. So the idea that your nerves or your neurons can actually be moldable or changeable in your brain. And so that's what we're focused on this evening, is how we can change our brains or change our nerves in our brains. So the other piece to my title was how to teach an old brain a new trick. And that comes from this old adage that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And that's actually a misconception. So research has shown that we can indeed teach, well, for one thing, we can teach old dogs new tricks, and we can also teach old brains new ideas. We can learn new things, and we can actually establish new neural pathways in the brain. And it's good to remember that our brains are actually hardwired to learn. So from birth, your brain is structured and organized in such a way that it actually focuses specifically on the novel and ignores the redundant. And so a good way that I think most people in this room and online have done is if you've ever commuted to a job or to school in your car, and you realize you have no memory of that commute because you do it every single day, you drive that same path every single day. Well, what your brain is doing in that particular example is it's just filtering out what it deems redundant, because you do it all the time. It sees that same path, that same road all the time. And so we literally your brain loves when things are novel or new in its environment. We're instinctually programmed to focus on new or novel things. So the nice thing is that means your brain is actually kind of you can think of it like your learning ally, right? So it wants to learn new things. You just have to set it up well to do that. And that's what we'll talk about tonight. And even if you're not, in case you're not convinced that you as a human can learn a new trick, I included this slide in here to let you know that even fish can learn new tricks. So you may have caught in Michelle's introduction of my background. I was fortunate to spend a couple of years working for the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and the animal behavior staff there were kind enough to include me in their training sessions. And they were training, in this case, a giant sea bass, which is a really large fish, upwards of 150, 200-pound fish. So the humans and the fish need to remain safe for veterinary examinations and health examinations of the animals. So it behooved the staff to train them. So what you can see here on the slide, the image on the left, you've got 3 human scuba divers and then 1 giant sea bass floating up on the left. And if you may notice, the sea bass is headed towards what looks like sort of a blue square that's being sort of held out in front of the diver. So what they're doing is they're training each individual fish for this species, there were 3 of them in this exhibit, to come to a particular colored and shaped target. So this fish is being trained to approach only a blue square. Okay, and then on the right, a different sea bass, you probably can't tell the difference between them, but this one's a different sea bass, is approaching me actually here, and it's hard to see in the picture, but it's a red circle, and coming into this sort of blue and white PVC structure. It's a stretcher, so the stretcher is used to actually manage holding of the animal, again, to have veterinary staff and medical staff examine them. So inherently, you may think that the fish clearly are never going to have encountered this sort of stimulus out in the wild, and yet here they are, their brain, which arguably is quite a bit simpler than the human central nervous system and the human brain, and yet they're able to learn these new behaviors and these new tricks. Their brain is able to make the connection that they can come to the target, and then the key part here is they get a reward. Okay, so I'll come back to that idea of a reward, but in this case for the giant sea bass, we used food. So they love raw squid, raw salmon, sardines, pretty much any kind of raw fish. The larger fish like to come to that. There were actually, there was one fish that didn't like the food as much as it liked other types of stimuli, so we had to work with a different sort of reward. But the reward, that positive reinforcement, is really critical to the learning process, and I'll come back to that. So if a fish can learn, I think you guys can too. And so to start out our kind of examination of, okay, how does the brain learn? I decided we really needed to look at the structure of the brain so we can talk about the different parts and how it works. This image here is pretty old school. So they've got your brain, and it's sort of compartmentalized into these separate compartments, and they've got up their memories and cognitive comprehension. The thing is what we know now from current neurological research is our brain doesn't operate in such a compartmentalized way. So most tasks that we do and most thinking that we do, it integrates all different parts of the brain and uses many different parts of the brain. But understanding where some main roles are structurally gets at the function of this part of our body. So looking closer at specifically at the human brain, I've got 3 kind of images up here, and we'll start with the one on the left. So it says dense fiber pathways. What that means is if you were to take a human brain and kind of cut it open and look at it, and actually really any animal brain, it has, and you may have heard these terms before, it has white matter and gray matter in it. So those are just referring to actually how the cells in the brain are oriented. So the white matter is fibers, and it's actually, the white matter is made up of axons. So if you look at the middle image here, where it says we've got 100 billion neurons in your brain, that's a lot of cells, it's this kind of cartoon image of a nerve cell. So if you look at the middle part of the nerve cell, it's this long strand that kind of extends downward. That's the axon. So white matter is just a whole bunch of axons that are clustered and organized together. And gray matter is the top part of this cartoon. So kind of this red, the cell body, and yellow here in the middle is the nucleus. And then you may even notice or note that kind of the red cell body has all these like huge extensions, these like long finger-like kind of projections that come off the cell. Those are called dendrites. And if you have 100 billion neurons that make up your brain, all of those hundreds of dendrites that come off the cell body, they can each individually interact with another nerve cell. So that means every nerve cell is capable of making hundreds of other connections with all the other 100 billion nerve cells that are in your brain. So if you imagine it like that, it's this massively interconnected network. And then the other kind of structural feature about the nerve cell that's helpful for tonight is in, I don't know, blue or purpley kind of colored, looks like kind of blue, purpley colored rectangles that are actually a sheath. They insulate and go around the axon, and it's called a myelin sheath. And so we'll come back to what that's doing, but it coats a lot of these nerves. It doesn't coat every single nerve, but many nerves are coated in this. And then if you follow your eyes all the way down to the bottom of the nerve cell, there are also all of these axon terminals, also sometimes called confusingly dendrites as well. And they also come out in that big kind of branching pattern and can connect up with other nerve cells. Okay, so that's what makes up your brain, is tons and tons, 100 billion of these neurons or nerve cells. And then on the far right of this image, we've got three main parts of the brain that we'll focus on tonight. There are many other structures, and the brain is organized by these structures. But for this presentation, it's most helpful if we just look at these three main parts. And up at the top, kind of where we think of like our classic, what our brain mostly is made up of mass-wise when we look at it, is the cerebrum. And you may also hear it or read it named by in a different name. So sometimes it's called the cortex, or even sometimes the cerebral cortex. So cerebrum, same thing as cerebral cortex, same thing as cortex, if you see it written that way. And then all of you who are here in person and then also at home, if you take your hand right now and you kind of put it on the back of your neck, and then move up until you feel sort of that base of your skull, you're kind of getting right at where your cerebellum is. It's a little kind of knob there that's at the very back and low part of your brain. And then also right kind of inward from that and below is the brainstem. So the brainstem connects directly in with the spinal cord. So we'll come back to these three parts here in just a minute, but at least that kind of sets up what we're talking about when you think about different brain structures. All right, so how does information come into your brain? So right now you're sitting and you're listening, or you're standing, you're listening to this talk, and information's coming at you. It's coming into your brain through sensory receptors. Well, it turns out the very first structure in our brain that makes a decision or does anything with this information is called the amygdala. So the amygdala, and it's shown, and on both of these images is like kind of a little just circle, but it's found buried at the top of the, kind of in the middle of the cerebrum. And your amygdala is a part of the brain that it acts like a switching station. So on like a train track or a train. So essentially deciding whether the train's going to go left or the train's going to go right. So the amygdala acts like a filter in that way, that it's going to decide where this new information coming in is going to go. It literally sends it to one part of the brain or to another part of the brain. And how that's controlled is in part by what state our brain and the rest of our body is in. So you may have heard of flight or fight. So this is getting at the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems in our body, our nervous systems. And if you focus on the left side of the image or cartoon here, when we're in a low emotion state, so we're not in flight or fight, we're calm, we're relaxed, what happens is new information comes in, it hits that amygdala, the amygdala decides to send it right up to the higher cortex. So that was your cerebral cortex, your cerebrum, which is where you're capable of doing problem solving. It's how you're capable of synthesizing ideas, comparing ideas and concepts. It's where you're able to have higher cognitive function. It's how you're able to be creative. It's where your memory bank is. All these like fantastic, cool ways that humans can process information, that's all found in the higher cortex. So your amygdala, when you're in a low emotion state, sends information right up there. Cool, that's great. That's what we want in this case when we're trying to learn. However, on the right side here, we have this other person in a different state, or the same person in a different state. So when we are in that, what is often called flight or fight, so we're in a high emotion state, meaning we've got a lot of anxiety or fear, or even the positive high emotions, like a lot of super high excitement, your amygdala takes that new incoming information, does not send it up to the higher cortex. It takes that information, sends it straight down to the brainstem. Okay? It actually, your higher thinking levels are totally disabled in that state. And there is a good reason for that from an evolutionary standpoint. So your brainstem is sometimes called, you may have heard it called like the animal brain, the lower brain. It's considered the reactive brain. So it's really responsible for survival. So it's not doing any kind of problem solving. It's not doing any creative thinking, any synthesis of ideas. Brainstem is very reactive. It's just literally, do I stay and fight or do I run away? It's only focused on survival, which is great. We do need that function as well. We may think that we only needed that, many thousands of years ago when a tiger was chasing us, but those kinds of situations do come into play even in our modern world. So our brainstem's very useful for that. However, it's good to note that as far as for you to be able to learn new information, you need to be in that calm state and not in the high emotion state. Because your brain it's deciding for you. The amygdala is just shuttling information straight down to the brainstem. So any output that you could do with that new information is just going to be reactive and emotional and not in a kind of a more problem-solving state. And it won't stick in your memory. So memory isn't affected by this amygdala hijacking phenomenon. Okay, so how do we learn? How does the brain learn? Nice, easy steps. Step one is stay calm. So that might sound super easy to do. And if anybody here listening, I think most folks here have been in a classroom before as a child, when you're, or even as an adult. If you're really embarrassed by something or you feel anxiety in that way, you're not learning. So you're not learning in the true sense, which is hard to overcome. So one thing we can do to help us to learn and to increase our neuroplasticity is to just stop and breathe. Sometimes that's the most simplest thing, and recognize that you are in that state. And you can feel it by increased heart rate. You've got adrenaline, cortisol in your body, anxiety. Your breathing rate might be different, feel constricted. So we want to be in the state where our body's producing the hormone oxytocin, which helps us to be peaceful, connected, trusting. So you need to be in that calm state to truly be able to learn new information. So something as simple, I know it sounds silly, but something as simple as taking a deep breath or walking out of the room, then coming back, your brain will literally be in a better state to be able to synthesize and learn new information. Okay, I mentioned rewards with the giant sea bass. So they love raw squid. I would guess that the folks here would not qualify that as a good reward if I dangled a raw squid in front of you. I don't know, maybe that's your thing. Maybe cooked squid would be a little more rewarding. But it turns out that humans, we are rewarded. Of course, by food is one of them, but we also have both extrinsic and intrinsic rewards. So extrinsic meaning it's coming from the outside. Intrinsic, you're producing it with your own body. And sometimes those two are related. So an extrinsic reward would be the squid, or maybe a cupcake is a better example. But then when you eat or you receive that reward, your brain produces intrinsic rewards, And the example I have up here is dopamine. So I've got the chemical structure of dopamine, and we'll talk a little more detail about dopamine in just a minute, but that is a reward to your brain, and your brain loves rewards. It's hardwired to notice new and novel, like I mentioned, and it's also hardwired to respond to rewards. And dopamine, actually, it's a pretty simple chemical, but it falls into a class of chemicals that are called neurotransmitters. So I know my class that's present here, we've been talking about neurotransmitters in class, but for the folks who might be listening in at home and are less familiar with neurotransmitters, again, I like to break down the word. So neuro meaning neuron or nerve, and then transmitter literally means to transmit. So to pass information, or in this case, translate from an electrical signal to a chemical back to an electrical signal. So the way neurotransmitters work is, if you look at the cartoon of the brain, what it's showing here is kind of like a zoomed in view of two nerve cells. And remember, if we think about the many slides back, the little cartoon of the nerve cell with the red cell body, and it had all those like long projections that came off of it that are called dendrites. So they are able to connect with all these other nerve cells. So that's what it's showing, is like two dendrites, two nerve cells, projections coming right together. But the key is they don't actually touch. So each nerve cell is very, very close to other nerve cells, but they don't actually touch. There's a gap between them. And that gap is called a synapse. So somehow electrical voltage signal has to move from one nerve cell to the next cell with a gap. And the best way, I like to think of it like if you've ever yourself participated in or watched a relay race, where a person might be running in a race and they have a baton and they're running and they have to get to the next person and pass the baton off. And then that next person in their team can start running. So that's a little bit like how a neurotransmitter works. It's the baton that's moving between the two people and passing that communication onward. So that's what a neurotransmitter does, is it helps relay the message from one nerve cell to the next nerve cell, to the next nerve cell, to the next. And we have, our body makes a ton of these neurotransmitters. So there are a lot, and they vary pretty greatly in their structure and chemically how they're formed. But what I put up here for you guys is, let's see, I think I put 8 of them. And some of them might be terms you've even heard of in your everyday lives, like serotonin. We just mentioned dopamine. GABA is a big one. Adrenaline we also mentioned. So those are all neurotransmitters, and they result or do different things in the body depending on which cell and what receptor is receiving them. So in this case, I mentioned dopamine was a reward. So it turns out for us, for our brains, neurotransmitters are rewards, but we can do certain actions and we can think in certain ways, and even things like our breathing can affect whether our brain is producing these rewards. Okay. So coming back again to those easy steps of how does the brain learn. Step 1 was stay calm, right? Keep yourself in that low emotion state, not in flight or fight, so that your amygdala sends that information right up to the higher cortex so that you can commit it to memory and synthesize the ideas. Step 2, reward yourself. So maybe everyone's going to go buy a cupcake after this talk. But it can be, obviously food can be a great reward for the giant sea bass and a great reward for humans. We just have to make sure that it's a healthy relationship with that food. But what I wanted to share with you is an alternative also to the idea of a food reward. Your brain likes it even when you just notice and positively reward yourself with positive thinking. I know that sounds kind of like silly and woo-woo a little bit, but let's see, like a good example is if you were, say, at the grocery store and you forgot to bring your list with you, but you're going along with your cart, and suddenly light bulb goes off and you remember, oh yeah, I was going to get apples. So you go over to buy the apples. If you just take the second or two it takes to internally in your own brain, just be like, Charmaine, awesome job. You remembered the apples. Good for you. And I know that for some people that might be easy and you already do that. For some that might sound super kind of dorky, but it's that patting yourself on the back and taking a minute to do that. What that actually does is your brain grabs onto that. It produces a whole bunch of dopamine and reward, those internal neurotransmitter rewards, and it'll always keep firing those nerves in that pathway. It's like, oh great, Charmaine, she loves it when we remember stuff. So we're gonna keep remembering things. The brain likes to stay in the same pathway, like a worn rut with a wheelbarrow. So if you are always thinking negatively, your brain's gonna keep doing that same pathway. Whereas if you reward yourself by being like, nice job, remember the apples, go team, then your brain will fire that same set of neurons that taps into memory. So that's one of the ways you can help your brain to learn is rewarding yourself. Another way is kind of steering away from the rewards and the neurotransmitters, but it has to do with movement. So we talked about the brainstem and how it's the reactive brain. Well, pure numbers of neuron-wise, not size-wise, but packed in numbers of neurons, the brainstem has 80% of our neurons. So that's a huge bulk of our brain. And the brainstem, one of its main functions is controlling movement for our body. So balance, coordination, all of that is controlled by the brainstem. So it appears, researchers, when they've looked at it and the structures of the brain and what they're controlling, it seems our brain was literally evolved and formed to control our movement. That's the main job that it does. And we think of it as all the other cool jobs that we do, like dreaming and creativity and coming up with amazing new ideas and innovative ideas. But a bulk of our brain is there to control how our bodies move. And then if you look further, and the structure that controls the hand movement is disproportionately large compared to the rest of the brainstem structures. So folks, neurobiologists have focused more, especially in recent years, on the brainstem and on hand movement and what that does to our brains. And some of the studies they conducted were really cool, and they found that hand movement in particular, they often are calling it a prehistoric Prozac. They find folks, so what they looked at was folks who move their hands a lot and folks that don't move their hands at all or much, and folks that move their hands a lot, whether for work or for hobbies, have a much higher increased blood flow to their brain. And the reason we want blood going into our brain is it brings in oxygen, brings in nutrients, helps promote healthy cells. And further, another, which was really exciting discovery again in recent years, was originally everyone thought that if you have nerve or neural damage in your brain, it's utterly gone. You cannot replace it, you cannot regenerate or repair it. And to a certain extent that is true. So major brain trauma, there are limitations. But in recent years, what they found, and again connected to hand movement, is a lot of hand movement promoted growth of new nerves. So this is a form of adult neurogenesis. So neuro and genesis meaning you're generating and producing brand new nerve cells. And these are coming from adult stem cells, and they're located in the hippocampus. So your hippocampus is a major part of the brain in control of memory. So short-term, long-term memory, which has a ton to do with learning, right? When we learn something new, we want to be able to keep it in our memory. So it turns out that if you already have some of these hobbies, that's great. And if you don't, maybe it's a good time to incorporate them into your life. I've got a couple images up here, one of knitting, somebody who's knitting, and another of somebody who's working wood. But they found anything you can imagine in your brain that might use your hands, like painting or playing a musical instrument or gardening, doing sign language, dance, even taking time at home to slow down and wash the dishes by hand, that kind of repetitive hand movement. Our brain loves that. It starts putting more blood supply to the brain. You create neurogenesis going on, more new nerve cells. Even I was just talking the other night in one of my other classes, we were examining some of specific here to Southeast Alaska. We were talking about some of the indigenous ways that folks used to gather foods and pick berries and process them at home. That's a ton of that kind of repetitive and fluid sort of motions with the hands. And we didn't know this, of course, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. People just did it instinctively. But as a society, we've unfortunately become a lot more sedentary, and we don't do as much of that hand movement, those old ways. So current and modern neurobiology research is showing that we need those hand movements to keep our brain nice and healthy and happy. So step 3 of how can you get your brain to learn? How can you have more neuroplasticity? 1, stay calm. Make sure you're in that nice low motion state. Step 2, reward yourself. That can be as simple as that internal patting yourself on the back thought just briefly throughout your day. And then step 3, move. And that's your whole body. The more you move your whole body, just walking again or dancing or stretching, but it's particularly the hands. Being able to move the hands seems to be key to keeping our brains healthy. All right, kind of moving one last piece to this idea of neuroplasticity this evening is that, again, I came back to another old adage or saying was, I don't know if folks here have heard that saying that practice makes perfect. So I hate that saying. I don't think it's a good saying. I think you could more correctly say perfect practice makes perfect. But imagine if you're practicing it incorrectly, or you're practicing it wrong, or you're even practicing it in a harmful way. So maybe you're making a body movement that is hard on the joints, or it's misaligned or something like that. And you practice it over and over and over again. Your body remembers that incorrect way or that wrong way. So I like to change that saying from practice makes perfect to practice makes permanent. Because whatever you do repetitively and over, your brain likes that. It'll store that up, and it's going to make those neural connections, those neural pathways more permanent. And so there's a saying that nerves that fire together wire together. So they're always going to be kind of threaded and connected together. And I have an image up here, sort of over on the left, of a child playing baseball. So baseball is a nice one to use as an example, because there's a lot more happening than you might initially think. You might look at it and think, okay, that's a pretty simple activity or task. But what's happening in the child's brain during this is it's receiving a whole bunch of input about the ball. So the speed of the ball, the height the ball's coming at them, whether there's a spin on it, all of that information, and even the other people who are involved in the game at the time. So brain is doing that. It's taking in all this information about the ball. Also, at the same time, the child's holding a bat in their hand, right? So that means the brain needs to send signals to the muscles in their arms, the muscles in their back and their legs. Their whole body needs to take those muscles and contract in order to move the bat towards the ball, right? So your brain is both receiving in information and also sending signals to the body on how to react. So if a person, a child or an adult, is to practice that over and over and over again, the idea of hitting a ball with a baseball bat, the nerves in the brain, the ones that were receiving information about the ball, and the cluster of nerves that are telling muscles to contract in the right way, those start to fire together. They're clustered together. They're always going to be kind of found in a pathway together if the person does that activity over and over and over and over again. So that's the idea of practice makes permanent. Practice actually makes different nerves and different parts of the brain cluster and fire together and connect together so that they're found in kind of more of a communication unit, whereas they maybe used to be separate. But you've combined them by doing that activity over and over. The other thing I put up here on this slide was frequency and recency. So maybe, for example, you played baseball as a child and you played it a lot and you got really good and you got those nerves in your brain to cluster together, but then you didn't play again for 30 years. So 30-year gap, didn't play baseball at all. So that's not very frequent or recent as far as recent time, right? So if you did go to do it again, those nerves haven't fired together in a really long time, so they're going to be kind of clunky at it. They're not going to be as clunky as it was the very first time you did it, but they're not going to be super smooth or fluid in their electrical signals to each other. So if we want something to be fluid and those nerves to be kind of firing together, we have to do it recent and frequent. So if there is that big gap in time, we kind of lose some of those connections that we formed. And the pathways I'm talking about are all in the those connections and clustering. It's happening in the white matter of the brain. So remember we talked about gray matter and white matter. Well, this is occurring in the white matter of the brain. Okay, and then the other thing I've got in this slide might look a little intimidating if you're not a molecular biologist, but I can walk us through it. So it's a cartoon image of a protein that our body makes that's in our brain called the ARC protein, so ARC. And if you're looking at this image here and it sort of looks similar to stuff we see a lot these days in the news and all over any kind of information source, if it looks sort of virus-like to you, you're in the right thinking, because it's a lot of folks call the ARC protein a virus-like protein because the way it is encapsulated, so it has this what's called an ARC capsid, so it's the red kind of hexagon shape there that comes around the messenger RNA of the ARC, and then that's how it gets transmitted over to another cell. So that's what's happening in a nutshell in this image. Is there's a cell on the left and a cell on the right, and this ARC protein's going from one cell to another. And the reason I wanted to bring up the ARC protein this evening, this kind of crazy virus-like protein that we have in our own brains that we make, is ARC has been found real recently to regulate a ton about the health of neurons. So it regulates the synapse. It actually, coming back to that baseball example, if you are learning baseball and so you're connecting those ball neuron information to the bat neuron information and the muscle contraction neuron information, ARC sees that and it helps to cluster and strengthen those connections. And even going a step further, it actually weakens the other connections around it. So it will strengthen two nerves that are connecting and communicating and weaken the neighbors, like almost inhibiting or downplaying other electrical connections that are not pertinent to that baseball activity, for example. So ARC helps to strengthen nerves that are firing together, and it weakens the neighbors around it. And we have this protein in our brain. All right, so starting to wrap it up here, coming back to that original term in the title, neuroplasticity. So what does neuroplasticity really mean? It means you're making new and more complex pathways and connections with all those finger-like dendrites that can come out and stick to the other nerve cells. If you increase neuroplasticity in your brain, you also increase the myelin sheath. Remember we looked at that nerve cell back at the beginning, and the long axon is actually insulated by a myelin sheath. So your body is capable of packing on more insulation, more myelin sheath. And what that means is your nerve fires faster. So if you have a lot of myelin sheath, faster signals, faster brain activity. And neuroplasticity also means more blood flow coming into our brain, and our hand movement can help with that. That increased blood flow brings in oxygen, nutrients. We're capable of generating more nerves to a limited extent, but we can do that by increasing our neuroplasticity. And we have new nerves talking and firing and signaling to each other that maybe never used to do that. And then I wanted to close with just a quick example of, okay, how could I actually really implement this and bring all those pieces together in a day-to-day life? So how do I stay in that calm state and work on rewarding myself, bring in the idea of movement and hand movement? Well, one of the things that cognitive therapists do, and it's usually when they're working with folks who've had injury to their brain, so brain trauma injury, but I think it can greatly, benefit everybody. You don't have to have a brain trauma injury to do some of these exercises. I wish they were more published or educated to the public. And one of the activities, I guess you could say, that cognitive therapists do to help folks with brain trauma injury is they bring in all these different aspects. So what it looks like is they would have a patient pull in the part of their brain that involves balance. So what they'd have them do is maybe stand on one foot, or even be balancing on a wobble board. If you've ever seen that, it's like kind of a big wood board and has a sort of a half circle underneath, so you're tilting in all directions. That might be like a little more advanced stage of this, but standing on one foot works also. So they'd have the patient doing that. Then they would also have the patient taking a ball or something similar and tossing it back and forth with another person in the room. And the person in the room is moving around. So the ball's coming at them from different angles throughout the room, and they might throw it high, they might throw it low, all while the person is balancing. So they've got two things going on, balls throwing back and forth, and they're balancing. Then they bring a third in, and that's the memory component of your brain. So what they might have a patient do is, an example would be name a type of fruit for every letter of the alphabet, okay? Or recite the alphabet backwards, or name a person that you know in your life for every letter of the alphabet. And so you're doing that verbally out loud while tossing the ball and while balancing. And it sounds super silly, or maybe it sounds really tricky, and I think you can kind of start slow and just incorporate one or two of those, like maybe just do the balance and the verbal memory task, or maybe just throwing the ball in the verbal memory task. But those are the kinds of activities that folks do to help repair brain injury. And it's been shown over and over again, it increases neuroplasticity to do those kinds of activities. And I can think of tons of other those kinds of activities and tasks that you can do to promote neuroplasticity, and would be happy to share them too at the end of the talk. But that was one example that I thought of. All right, so that's how we get a healthier and faster signaling brain. And I really appreciate, again, all of my students to be here in person, and any folks watching online at home. I appreciate your time, and I hope you took away some little thing. It's always hard to remember everything, but hopefully some small little nugget of information, and maybe as you're going about your daily life, you'll reward yourself a little bit more, or you'll try balancing on one foot while you brush your teeth, or something along those lines. And then definitely, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So last example, that sounded like it would be hard to do for a healthy person. Balancing while I'm catching balls and repeating the alphabet backwards. But you're saying that this is a recovery tool for someone that's suffered a stroke?
Yeah, so just to repeat the question in case it didn't quite get picked up, Yeah, so just asking that, it sounds like that last example I had where you're working on balance and you're tossing a ball and you're reciting, you know, letters of the alphabet with fruit names. That sounds like that'd be hard for even a person in the height of health. And yet they're asking folks who've had an injury to do this. Yeah, they start slow. So you may not even make it through the whole alphabet. Maybe you make it through 3 or 4 letters. Maybe you're not on a wobble board to begin with. You're just standing on one foot and kind of keep touching to regain balance, especially if balance is impaired in any way. Yet clearly they'd have to do it in a safe way so the person doesn't fall or anything like that. But yeah, you can start slow. And the tossing the ball is not coming at you like a fastball or anything. And I think, again, we tend to forget how routine we get in our lives, that we don't work on some of those kind of brain, sometimes people call them brain games, or sort of giving our brain something new to do. But it's super healthy for us. But if we do start slower, like you're pointing out, to kind of work your way up to it, can help.
These are kind of unrelated.
Yeah.
I mean, the alphabet, bananas, fruits and things, and balancing seem quite unrelated.
Yeah, so again, the comment or the question was that, the idea of naming fruits, which is a memory recall kind of thing, activity in your brain, and then balance seem very unrelated and unconnected. And they do, I agree. But researchers that have shown through their studies that when we pair those, we strengthen those unrelated connections, and just the generation of new connections, our brain loves that. It seems to really respond well to it. And that's when we start seeing the generation of new cells in the hippocampus. That's when our body will release a lot of the endorphins and dopamines, that internal reward system. Yeah, it is. I agree. It does seem very unrelated, and yet our brain is kind of a holistic, all the areas are connecting, and so if we don't force it to connect them, it gets lazy and just keeps those pathways kind of deadened. Yeah. Any other questions from you guys?
So I noticed a lot of older people, or some of them, that are worried about losing cognitive function. They're interested in doing crossword puzzles. There's this Chinese game, I think, called Sudoku or Sudoku, math problems.
Yeah.
Things like that. That's along a similar line of forcing the brain to be working through problems, and it's making it more viable.
Yeah. So his comment was just that folks, especially as we age, worry about losing cognitive function, and there doctors I think have suggested in the past, or maybe it's just kind of out there amongst our cultural knowledge, that you should be doing things like crosswords and like the Rubik's Cube, the old kind of puzzle, 3-dimensional puzzle. And it's true. And I think if we incorporate movement with it, then you've got an even stronger way to help maintain some of those, help prevent some memory loss, help maintain the cognitive function. Even things, I know that life expectancy, they've shown folks that work longer, which is counterintuitive sometimes. We kind of want to relax and not retire so late in age. But I think part of that is the fact that your brain is staying actively engaged with day-to-day activities. And there's a lot to other emotional and spiritual connections that are happening, I think, with interacting with other humans. But just the fact that your brain is staying active throughout your life, as far as being exposed to new things, new people, new conversations, new ideas, is huge. Yeah.
Well, I certainly noticed, Supreme Court justices oftentimes quite old, but when you listen to them talk, Scalia and the others, Ginsburg, very, very bright.
Right.
Very quick.
Right. Yeah.
They're not befuddled and.
Yeah, that's a great observation, I think. I've noticed that in my own work too. I had at my previous institution, I had quite a few professor emeritus, so they're retired, but they still have office space and they're able to come to seminars and talk to people and share ideas. And one gentleman who's a huge name in genetics did a ton of work for the field years and years ago, and he was in his early 90s when I interacted with him, and he was super sharp. I mean, he would get tired frequently and nap often during the seminars, but then would wake up and ask the most brilliant question, you know. So it's, and some of that is genetics that plays a role, and what we're exposed to our whole lifespan and in the environment. But we can definitely do things to help our brain. And some of them are pretty manageable on a day-to-day basis, yeah.
So Jesse online would like to know, what effect does standing at your computer station at work have, and does that exertion help the brain? Because now we have the standing desks,
Yeah.
better than sitting. Should I have stood to ask this?
Yeah, so great question from online. Yeah, does standing at our desk benefit the brain? It definitely benefits our spine, they've shown, and our hip. So the skeletal structures in our body are definitely benefited by less sitting. Structurally, we weren't really built well to sit the way we do. It ends up causing a lot of hip and muscle kind of atrophy and tightening in areas unless we really focus on stretching and exercising those. So, but as far as the nervous system and your brain, you know, I think especially if you're incorporating movement, so if you are moving back and forth on your feet at all while you're standing at your desk and doing computer work, I think that can help. And like frequent, you know, stretching and moving the hands a little bit more and rolling the shoulders. So anytime you have blood flowing more is when the brain really benefits. Yeah. Other questions? I thought I saw somebody else, but then, yeah, Jessica, yeah.
I was wondering, and you may have kind of touched on this, but like growing up, I had friends that were like smarter in certain subjects, or they just seemed to like, you know, naturally be more gifted in some area. So are we like born with more neurotransmitters, I guess, in one area of the brain versus the other, or is that just you're exposed to those things more as a baby, and so does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So her question is actually somewhat two different questions, but you may not have known it. So you asked a little about, are we born with the same number of neurotransmitters, or, you know, is there a fixed number of that or whatever? And then, but you were connecting it to folks that sometimes seem to be naturally more inclined towards learning a particular subject area or learning a particular sport or activity. So they're actually separate. So it doesn't have as much to do with the neurotransmitters. It's the question about natural proclivity towards a particular subject area is a little outside of my range of expertise. I do know there's a genetic component to that because we see trends run in families sometimes, although not always. And there's also, there is some good research and literature out, and I'm blanking on the name of the author right now, but it's that old concept, if you ever heard of the 10,000 hours putting time in. So that kind of comes back to when I said practice makes permanent. And some folks, if they're exposed early, which you did mention that, if they're exposed early and are just put tons of time in on it, sometimes become much more successful in that particular area or doing that particular activity. So some of it is an amount of time thing, some of it is a genetics thing. And certainly our brains are structured differently. And I think they're still researching and trying to understand how and why that might be. And then your other question, which I know you had merged as one question, but the neurotransmitter, just to kind of make sure that's clear, we aren't, we are born with neurotransmitters, but we make them throughout our lifetime. And the nerve cells make them and they store them. And there's, as you probably can picture, both in the production of the neurotransmitters and the storing of them and the releasing of them, there are many steps in that like factory process that can go wrong, or that we ourselves with our own choices can actually damage or inhibit. And some of that has to do with diet and toxin exposure, some other aspects of our environment that we can kind of hurt our neurotransmitters or cause them to be not as many made. And even our actions. I know, right now in the media, dopamine's pretty well discussed, and we can definitely kind of skew our brain towards producing dopamine only for certain things like the cell phone and social media and things like that. So we definitely can have an effect on how much neurotransmitter we make and how healthy that whole step in that process is.